In this episode of Future Intersections presented by Wells Fargo, we're going to talk about the customer experience and driving customer centricity through innovation and technology, both central to how we can enable entirely new possibilities for brands, businesses to interact with their customers. Join me, Ather Williams III, and my special guest, Janet Balis, partner and EY America's marketing practice leader. Janet is a transformation leader in media and marketing, an innovator, a digital native, and a longtime change agent. So Janet, welcome. It's great to see you today.
Great to see you.
So you've got a fascinating role at EY. So you get to spend time with brands, thinking about evolution of customer experience, and then obviously technology and some of the more recent advances or things have been promoted around generative AI have been come to the forefront. But let's kind of peel it back to the beginning and think about sort of your core of what you advise clients on. So there's a evolution of the customer experience that's been driven by the convergence of many things, both customer preferences, new technologies, et cetera. So what kind of things are clients asking you, and what kind of advice are you sort of providing these days?
I think the first thing to focus on is that human expectations are higher than ever. And when I think about human expectations being higher than ever, it's partially driven by the pandemic because we became acclimated to these digital-only experiences, and we expected to be able to take advantage of many of the attributes of what happens in an e-commerce environment. And so suddenly we went back to the hybrid or the physical world, and our expectation was, I want all of that anticipatory, data-driven experience to follow me, but I want it to follow me wherever I am. So there's this challenge now that I think a lot of our clients face, which is to not think in channels that are in parallel. In fact, I hesitate to use the word omni-channel because it almost implies omni like in parallel, and it's not a parallelism anymore. It's this graceful dovetail that we have to create that says, I'm going to meet you, human, wherever you are, whenever you need me, based on data. I'm going to anticipate your needs. Sometimes I'll surprise and delight you, but I'm going to do that in a super intuitive way that connects the experience. And that's a real challenge for a lot of companies.
So I think that's a challenge that we see at Wells Fargo. So when I think about it, we have traditionally pre-pandemic, let's call it, you still had several million people a day visiting our nearly 5,000 branches. Then you have contact centers, and then you have other specialty offices, whether wealth management offices or mortgage offices, and then you have our digital properties. All of them were distinct experiences. We're all tied to the brand of Wells Fargo, and so we've embarked on this journey. Part of what my team is doing is how do we bring those things together, to your point. We've taken a pivot of saying we're going to be sort of mobile first, and let that design experience sort of drive into parts of what happens in the channel. But the piece that's been really challenging is one is getting the data so that we can follow you where you are and know and be predictive or anticipatory to your point. The other piece that's really hard is that there are a lot of channels where the human's purposefully in the middle. So when you have that moment that matters and you've had fraud or you have a big life event and you want to talk to someone, having that person in there but having them served up the information about you has been the challenge. It's both a training challenge and it's a cultural change because people are like, oh, I know you, Janet. We've been dealing together for 10 years. But when I present more data to you than you may know, creating the consistency of that experience has been a real challenge. Do you see that in other industries?
Absolutely. I think what you're talking about is it has to be a connection to a human. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a digital experience. In fact, I think they're very nuanced conversations that we have around should the buy flow, to be technical about, right? Should that experience take you through something that lands in a transaction that's actually going to take place online or a customer service experience that will take place online? Or in certain cases, is it something where the experience has the expectation of talking to a human? By the way, it's not even just about the human expectation. In some cases, it can be a better business outcome. So that's the other thing, which is as we go through this, it's a question of, well, maybe if I talk to them as a human, if I'm served the right data, as you just talked about, and if we can train people to use that data to inform their conversation, could they potentially sell more? And of course, we probably don't think in a sales mode, we think in a solution orientation. How can I solve problems for my customer? But could it actually generate more revenue for the company if we put a human in certain kinds of customer journeys. And I think that that nuance is really important to recognize. But yeah, I completely relate to everything you're saying. I mean, I'm curious as you go through that, how you're overcoming some of the silos in the organization also, because it's such a vast company.
Yeah, well, the silos are almost historically purposeful. And I think that when we think about it, the first thing we're doing is we're focusing on the data. And so how do we get the data structured such that we can have, whether it's a human channel or a digital channel, it be sort of the same thing? And then we're starting to converge around some of the technology. So for example, traditionally you call a contact center, you get the IVR, right? The dreaded press 1 for English, press 2 for Spanish,
Delightful.
and then work through your little logic tree. But then if you go into our mobile app, we have Fargo, which is an AI-powered digital assistant based on Google's Dialogflow natural language processing engine. And so we're now taking that same engine and saying, well, that should be the experience you have when you call. And so whether it is text or it's voice, you should be able to have a similar experience. And we also then have the same knowledge base being shared both channels. Now the question is, how do we extend that to the banker desktop? The other part then is getting people to not be afraid of technology. I'm old enough to remember when ATMs came out and everyone's like, okay, that's going to be the death of tellers. Well, we still have tens of thousands of tellers and they're not going away. And so ATMs became an augmented experience. It's an option to get cash or deposit a check.
Sure.
But it's not the only option. And so I think that's an analogy we can use for our teams.
Well, as I listen to that, what's so interesting to me is I think that we've been misserved by the narrative that the press has created really around AI and technology. And it's almost what happened at the beginning when robotic process automation or intelligent automation came out on the scene. It was this dichotomy of, was it, use the word chatbot, but let's just take the bot part. Was it going to be the bot versus the human? Mm-hmm. And it was an either or, but it's not a versus. To your point, humans are calibrating the technology and making it intelligent about what the technology is actually telling us, and the technology is making us better at our jobs.
So obviously there's tons of buzz right now about artificial intelligence. And in some ways it's presented like it's a new phenomenon, but we both know that artificial intelligence has been around for a long time. If you use any streaming service, there's some algorithm behind it that's basically learning on your behaviors and offering you up content, be it music, video, etc. That's been going on for a long time. And we do that in the bank, and we look at fraud as an example.
Sure.
We look at pattern recognition and learn from your behaviors and where you are and you're traveling so we can be more predictive and we don't decline your credit card when we shouldn't, and we do when we should. And so that's there. But now there's this whole narrative around generative AI and how these large language models are going to change the world and put everyone out of business and take all the white-collar jobs out and everything else. So when you step back and you start meeting with brands and companies and saying, how do you help them frame their thinking around how should they think about the technology, and then how do they bring it into their companies to enhance the experience of their customers, their employees, and drive brand value?
So when I think about generative AI, the first thing is to understand why it's so different from the AI that's been around for so long. We've had predictive modeling, we've had machine learning, we've had artificial intelligence for some time that was able to basically learn from models. What's different at this moment is so much of the prior world when we worked with clients to get them ready for that moment was, let's get your data in order, let's get it really structured so that we can see it, get it interoperable. And there's some of that still needs to be there, and there certainly needs to be a certain level of data quality. So we focus a lot on getting the data maturity to the requisite level to drive this AI revolution. But the next part, though, is to understand that we can be a lot more liberal in terms of how we think about what data can come together, because generative AI looks at multimodal data, which essentially basically means lots of different kinds of data. So I can look at text or voice or video or images, and I can pull all of that together. And if I give the right prompt or challenge to the AI, it can actually give me an insight. Now, is the insight right? Is the data right? We have to challenge every step of the equation. And so part of the challenge is to help clients realize that humans are involved at every step. So humans are first involved to say, what data sets do we use to train the model? Humans are also involved in the flywheel productively to say which large language model are we going to use. Then when the results come out and you've asked the question of the model and you've asked for insights, we have to calibrate that as humans. Does it gut check? Does it make sense to us? We still need to apply human intuition. And if it's counterintuitive, we have to interrogate it further. And then we have to decide what action. So there's not this notion that the AI just goes off and runs the business. It's this interaction between humans and AI that allows us to either solve productivity and intelligence issues that make humans more productive in their individual jobs, or makes the enterprise think more holistically. So I'm very optimistic around the value creation that that's going to generate for the companies I'm working with. I'm curious, when you look at AI, though, how is it being received within Wells Fargo, and how are you thinking about getting in the right mindset?
Yeah, so it's a challenge because I would say that we are in a highly regulated industry. I think that the question for us is, when you think about AI can be empowering or create economic value, be able to sell more, recommend more product or solutions, or drive efficiencies in the micro. But the big question is, like, all right, that our operating community is wrestling with is, in the macro, how is it going to fundamentally front to back change a business, and over what time frame, and then what does that mean for the skills of the people you need to have in that business over time? It's the first time in probably the last year or so, the first time I ever heard the job like prompt engineer. Like, that's going to be a thing. There's people who they're
asking the right questions,
right. Which is kind of ironic because if you grew up in a more traditional context, asking the right questions is part of it's one of the core things of being a good journalist.
Sure.
And so there's some transferable skills, but we're trying to think about which parts of our company can benefit or will be impacted by this sooner rather than later, and how do we respond top to bottom? That's been the big sort of question. But the first step, candidly, that I've been spending time on is getting people educated.
Yeah.
Just, AI, as you and I both know, it's not one thing. It's not one type of artificial intelligence.
And it's changing every day.
Right.
So you also have to be a continuous learner. I work a lot in marketing. And if I think about the brands that I serve, they could apply a lot of AI internally to optimize how they use data, to think about how they, for example, target and find and communicate with the right consumers. Well, that's really wonderful. They can do that. And then they often work with agencies, who in many cases will help them buy their media, help them execute their creative at scale, do a lot of their activation, their measurement. Well, that's wonderful, except the agencies also have a lot of artificial intelligence deployed and a lot of data in their ecosystem. And then if you look at the media providers, they also have increasingly a lot of data and technology involved, let alone all the platforms and software and everything else that also has AI embedded. So if we're not very careful about how we architect things holistically and think about the connection points across ecosystems, so that's just one example of a marketplace, you can actually build things that don't create as much value as they're intended to, because anything that's in isolation trying to create the end-to-end solution is likely to fail.
Yeah.
Because it needs to connect with all of those other players that create value. So it's not a linear value chain any longer. It's this collaborative, data-driven ecosystem, but we have to embrace that. Otherwise, I fear that we're just going to have AI in bubbles that won't connect. So that's the big watch out for, I think, a lot of different industries and a lot of different functions. And you can apply the exact same analogy inside the company as well.
Is a critical thing that people, I think I know in our industry, underestimate. And it's always, we're so focused on the proprietary nature of the data, but the combination of my data and your data in the right ways, the right protections and the right permissions can create so much more value. And I think that one of the evolutions I've been thinking through at Wells Fargo is how do we move ourselves from being one point in that ecosystem to how do we help harness the ecosystem on behalf of our client. So we have a whole network of things that we need to bring together and think about how do we create insights from that to provide value to our underlying client, being a consumer or a company. And we're just, first pitch of the first inning of that game, but you can see that game playing out and saying that can be really powerful, but it's going to require us not only to change how we think about the value we bring, how we monetize that value and kind of the skills we have in-house. And also, we're going to have to challenge some preconceived notions on what's proprietary in terms of data, et cetera.
First, data privacy and protection is of paramount importance, and I know that that's sort of at the forefront of your thinking. And so that's an ante to be in the game, right? To protect that data around, in my case, Janet. That's the ante to be in the game. But as you create those insights, there's tremendous value to be created, because what we just did was 100 marketer global study of data maturity across companies. It just came out in the last week. And what's so interesting about what we found was first-party data was accelerating rapidly. So companies were harnessing the power of their own customer profile data. Mm-hmm. Third-party data was declining, but second-party data, the data we can create through partnerships, is holding steady, and there's still a lot of opportunity, and a lot of our clients are actually seeking partners who can help them enhance it. It doesn't necessarily need to be at the individual level. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it can be at the cohort level, and it still has incredible value to understand people like Janet give me that depth of insight. And you're still protecting my data, but we're starting to get a really extraordinary picture, because AI and data allows us to see things more holistically than ever before across the ecosystem. And that has incredible value both within and outside of your sector, which is really exciting.
One of the ongoing debates we have inside the bank is about brand value. And one of the phenomena we're dealing with as part of this ecosystem change is what's called embedded finance. So our clients would experience or consume or buy a Wells Fargo product outside of our ecosystem or in a partner's ecosystem. Mm-hmm. So if you're partnered with someone who's digitizing the home buying process, for example, you may get your financing as part of that. Or just like you do when you go buy a car, if you're going to get financing in the dealership, you're kind of experiencing that through the dealer.
Sure.
And so there's this whole question about subjugation of the brand to someone else. The best example I think about in banking is Apple and Goldman Sachs and credit cards. So everyone thinks it's the Apple card, mm-hmm. right? Because Apple's logo is on the front, Goldman Sachs logo is on the back. Well, Goldman Sachs carries all the risk, all the compliance issues, both financial risk, legal risk, compliance risk, all the customer service, but Apple has the brand. So when you're sitting with companies, you're saying it's becoming an ecosystem. How do you advise them to think about the value of their brand and how this can be brand enhancing, not brand destroying?
So what you're talking about is atomizing the brand, distributing it, syndicating it. But then the question becomes, how do you make sure that you've established that brand sufficiently? And most brands are going to compete on experience. So some of the brands that you talked about that have real strength, they have competed on experience. And that experience is singularly what distinguishes them from other companies in that technology ecosystem, for example. And so when you think about competing on experience and having a strong brand, it becomes really important to make sure that that brand health and that brand equity are there. And by the way, those are attributes of many companies that have suffered in the performance marketing swing that so many companies have really focused on, which is very important to driving top-line growth. But you need a balance of both brand marketing and performance marketing, because that brand equity becomes so important so people understand, what does your brand stand for? Is it served out in the experience? Is the brand promise realized when I go into a branch or when I go into a mobile app? Okay, now I know what that stands for. Now when it gets syndicated, when I see that logo or I see that brand name, I know what its attributes are, whether it's trust or confidence or quality of experience or anticipatory experience, whatever it is that you stand for, that becomes something that I've internalized, mm-hmm. and that's when you can syndicate freely without concern that you'll be commoditized as simply being a utility in that experience.
Let's pivot for a second, because when I think about the delivering on that brand promise, part of my mind goes to culture and the underlying, both values of the company, but also just changing the culture. And so when you see some of the best companies that you've dealt with who've really made this transformation and embraced all the positive aspects of technology, digital and other, and made the change, what are some of the attributes or some of the things that jump out to you saying these are the kinds of things that you should look for or strive for?
Well, a few things. First, I'll start with it begins at the top of the organization. You have to walk the walk. So the notion that we have to be continuous learners, the notion that we have to, and I know that's something that you personally embrace a great deal, but the notion that we have to be intellectually curious, it has to be embedded in the culture. And I think that the workforce needs to see that in their leaders. They need to know that discomfort is going to come with the journey, because discomfort actually goes hand in hand with innovation. And if a team sees their leaders embracing that, it makes them more comfortable. The other side of it goes to the rest of the organization, which is the notion of creating a culture where great ideas and learning can come from anywhere, which is it's not just a top-down culture any longer. We have, particularly with these new technologies, many generational shifts afoot. And in some cases, those generations are not going to be sitting in the C-suite, not yet. So at this point, it's really important to make sure that there are deep and genuine connections to, in many cases, people that exist in the organization, but maybe don't have access to leadership to express their voices and really talk about what can transform the future of the human experience. So those are two things. The third thing I would highlight is I would not ever use, and I will apologize to all my consulting colleagues, but I don't believe in change management as a phrase even, because change management so often is that thing that happens at the end of the project or the end of the transformation. And it often manifests as a communication work stream or a training work stream where the decisions have been made, and now we need to educate all of you other people on how to go do that. But people need two things. They need to know what they're going to need to do now and how it's going to work, but they also need to know the why. So really getting into storytelling, bringing them along the journey, not just at the end, but throughout, really tapping into their human-centered emotions. So I think that those are all the kinds of things that are going to be really important to change culture, because it's not going to slow down. And I think organizational structures themselves are likely to go through pretty fundamental change. I won't get too scary with where it could go, but I do think it will change. It's not so much about workforce reduction as workforce transformation and organizational transformation to embrace this beautiful dovetail of humans and technology and AI that we've been talking about. But all of that requires openness, curiosity, learning, and some discomfort with not getting it right all the time, because that is not a foregone conclusion that everything will work.
All right, so you mentioned intellectual curiosity, which I know one of the many things we share in common. Where do you go to get to learn? Like, how do you approach learning?
Well, I probably listen to my clients as much as I talk to them. So that's the first thing. I think there's this assumption, for example, that as a professional service provider, I'm expected to come in with all the answers. And I appreciate, by the way, that you asked me for advice, and thank you. But honestly, I don't think that I have all the answers. I don't think any professional services provider has all of the answers. The question is, can they learn with you? So one thing that is teaching me is certainly that. Second is I study. I mean, I read a tremendous amount. When I go to conferences, I'm not just there to speak on the stage or do a video. I'm there to learn, and I take lots of notes, and then I go back and I think about it, and sometimes I'll write about it. But that writing for me is actually a synthesis of what did I learn? What did I actually take away from this? Because I'm processing this new information.
So
How are you learning?
Yeah, fortunately, in my job, I get to travel, and I spend a lot of time with both consumers and with businesses. So similar to you, it's a lot of listening. And so it's sitting down with corporate treasurers or CFOs and asking, so what are your challenges? Like, what are you doing? How's your job changing? Because ultimately, in banking, we're a service provider as well. And so I want to understand how all these shifts that we see from our side are impacting our clients. Therefore, how do we need to serve them differently? I've also started to pivot and take a lesson from my dad, actually, who said, you should read stuff that's not business and see what you can bring back into that. So
I love that.
The first little foray, starting in that recently, I just finished a book on the 1998 Yankees. The thing I took from that book is actually I took a lot about how to build culture. And that winning culture and that shared accountability they created in that team, which drove excellence, and the trust they had in one another. And so I think about lessons like that from other industries, walks of life, and how I can bring that back into my work balance. And so what I provide to my team, how do we create this sort of trust and shared accountability on my team, or with my peers in the operating committee. I think those are things that I try to bring in.
One of the interesting things I did actually a few years ago was I started a regular call. Once a month I have a call, and it's not strictly in my function. It goes beyond, and I sort of hug in anybody who's interested in learning about this topic. And it's not about my voice, it's about other voices. So it's a global call, and we bring lots of external speakers in to speak. And what's wonderful is that it's showing that we're walking the walk, and there's that consistency of message, going back to your cultural question, which is not only doing it myself, but also exposing others to it. Because sometimes we can send the article, send the video, read the thing, but also just bringing it to life and helping folks see our passions becomes really contagious.
Excellent. Janet, it was so great to see you again.
So great to see you.
Enjoyed our conversation and look forward to more.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Future Intersections. I'm Ather Williams III. Thank you for joining us today. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes where we will share advice and insights needed to stay one step ahead in today's ever-changing business landscape. If you really like this episode, please share with your peers and network. If you have a topic you'd like us to address or a guest you'd like to recommend, email us at futureintersections@wellsfargo.com. Future Intersections is produced by Wells Fargo.